questions.
All right, well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here, and I enjoyed the research for this. I'm going to just say up front, and it's going to sound like a cop-out, but I don't feel like we need a doctrinal statement on the doctrine of the church. I think actually the Apology 7 and 8 is really sufficient. I don't think it's actually difficult, and I don't think it's even controversial. So I did a pretty deep read through the confessions on this topic, and in Pieper and in Gerhardt, and then I read a book by Klug on the church and ministry, and it's really pretty straightforward. I think where the kind of rub comes, and so I'm not going to even rehearse it. I mean, we could all pretty easily say the church is nothing but the assembly of believers, right? That's what it is, and I don't think we disagree on that. I think where the question for me was interesting was what sort of impact might this have? Because one of the questions was, what are the implicit and explicit limits that might be set by the confessions and the scriptures? And what sort of concerns might you have, particularly with regards to polity? And so that's what I'm going to try to go after. So I'm going to limit myself to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, because I don't know anything about the OLM and so forth, and I think I know something about the problems in the Missouri Synod. And I have two theological concerns with regard to how ecclesiology is lived out amongst us, and I have a sort of practical concern. I wouldn't call any of them particularly grave, though maybe the first one is a bit grave, and that is the necessity of a judiciary. So the treatise states this in the negative sense. It confesses, when the church has been deprived of valid judicial process, it is not possible to remove ungodly teachings and impious forms of worship, and they destroy countless souls generation upon generation. Now, maybe that's not exactly explicit, but it's pretty close, that a judiciary of some sort is mandatory. Again, I don't think this would be controversial. The treatise isn't stating opinions here. This is, it's confessing our doctrine. But church polity on this side of glory has to have some way to decide serious matters. And my concern has to do with whether or not the Missouri Synod's current process of dispute resolution, dissent, and the other procedure through the district presidents of expulsion are a proper judiciary that actually has the capacity, authority, and will to deal with ungodly teaching and impious worship. My concern lies in how virtually all disputes in the Missouri Synod are actually pigeonholed into either the dispute resolution process or the other processes that are based on an idea of reconciliation that is better suited for miscommunication or bad behavior that arises from weaknesses rather than doctrinal differences. So here we'll get at it in a few minutes. My second concern is less with the Missouri Synod herself and more with her sister churches, those we are in fellowship with. In the last 30 years, we have joined into fellowship with a number of church bodies around the world in sort of a great drunken joy that is now kind of coming back to haunt us. And I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think, in fairness, I think everyone is sort of starting to recognize this. They were a great sort of heyday of excitement when these sort of awakening confessional Lutheran churches, particularly from the Soviet bloc and other places, and we're like, oh, this is great. We've got brothers and sisters in Christ, and we were excited, and we didn't ask enough questions. And some of this is coming back to haunt us, particularly in Europe, where we have some church bodies that claim to have apostolic succession that derives from a genealogy of bishops, along with apostolic doctrine, but they put a kind of emphasis here on the succession of bishops, ordination by bishops, and a genealogy that, pretends to go all the way back to St. Peter. And of course, the treatise says, wherever the church exists, there is also the right to administer the gospel, the right to call, choose, and ordain ministers as a gift bestowed exclusively on the church, and no human authority can take it away from the church. A genealogy of bishops, Does everybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, good. A genealogy of bishops doesn't prevent this, but it's no guarantee of it, and nor should a genealogy of bishops be elevated to any place of great emphasis or benefit. I would say that, if your church body has this genealogy, good for you. It's a bit like, sort of being the oldest congregation in Minneapolis, or being a direct descendant of Martin Luther. Good for you. I would be proud of that if those were things that I had, but I wouldn't think that they were the mark of the church, or that they gave any particular authority. A misunderstanding here, or even a misemphasis upon what apostolic succession is, has led some of these bishops, one in particular, to engage in very bad practices that run up against biblical mandates and also good order. It also has the potential to confuse our own people as to where their certainty lies, and there are reports that it could undermine the doctrine of Scripture's perspicuity. So claiming not only that some sort of validity of the sacraments is tied to this, but also that bishops with a genealogy are the safeguard against misreading and misapplying the Bible. So those are pretty problematic, even though they're sort of not directly us, but it does impact us. And I think there's some confusion amongst us about it, frankly. So maybe I could have included something about apostolic, because it's already in there, though. It's already in the confessions. So that's why I don't know that it has to be added. My third concern, less dogmatic, more practical, but I think that the Missouri Synod's nomenclature for the office of the ministry and some of her polemical statements in the past, particularly with auxiliary ministers and her sort of refusal to recognize distinctions within the ministry, have caused confusion. And I think that we would be well served by better articulating the idea of distinct jurisdictions and human right limiting jurisdictions and actions of the ministers. So we'll get into that last. So the most serious concern, and that which I think will take the longest, is this, what I think is the lack of an actual judiciary. So I'm going to focus at least a functioning dictionary. And I'm posing this because of the polity question. So I know this isn't really theological, but we are going to have some confessional stuff here. But of course, even before you get there, we have to sort of deal with the deeper issue of church discipline in general and all of its difficulties. And of course, this is the place that the Missouri Synod has taken the most arrows from the other confessional Lutheran church bodies in America, and rightly so. Right? I mean, this is, if you talk to a confessional pastor in the Wisconsin Synod, he's going to say the problem with Missouri is no church discipline. And it's pretty hard to argue against that. That is a problem. So Melanchthon gives a very simple definition of the marks of the church because he is defending against the accusation that the Lutheran Church is anything but an illegitimate, sinful rebellion, and that no one in it, that is, anyone who is not in fellowship with the Pope, or all those who are not in fellowship with the Pope, are damned. So his response to this kind of boils down to this simple assertion, biblically proven, but simply that the church is principally an association of faith and the Holy Spirit in the hearts of persons, as opposed to a legal organization or that which can be seen merely by the eyes of men. He goes on, however, to say that it can be seen. This is where the Klug book was sort of interesting. I don't know why people are really worried about this language of invisible church. And when he went over to, did anybody read that book? It's about, it's probably 30 years old. At the end of this book, what he does is he went to Germany for 6 months, and also, I think, maybe Norway and Sweden. And he talked to all these Lutheran theologians about, he sent them his theses of what Luther's doctrine of church and ministry was, and then asked them to respond to it. And mostly it was pretty positive. But a lot of those Europeans really disliked this language of the invisibility of the church, which I think is a way overreaction on their part. Get over it. I mean, this is the foundational reality that we can't see into the hearts of men. And that doesn't mean that the church doesn't have marks visible, but anyway. So that's Melanchthon. Then he says, what are these marks, right? The church has external marks. It can be seen in this sense. It can be recognized, to use Melanchthon's language. And these marks are, from the Apology, the pure teaching of the gospel and the administration of the sacraments in harmony with the gospel of Christ. Luther's statement in the small called articles is even smaller. The church is holy believers, period, which he claims, of course, even a 7-year-old child knows. Now, there's no problem with these statements in themselves, but I do think they need to be unpacked a bit, lest they become minimalistic excuses that hide real abuse and neglect. Well, the gospel's being preached, the sacraments are being administered, who cares about anything else? In fact, Luther does unpack them quite a bit. You probably know in 1539, in the third part of his essay on the councils and the church. And there he lists 7 seemingly distinct marks of the church by which, but you could really kind of place all of them in some sense under Melanchthon's pure teaching and right administration. So what are they? Luther teaches us to recognize the true church where we see people who, 1, possess the word, 2, baptism, 3, the sacrament of the altar, 4, the public exercise of the keys, 5, the office of the ministry, and then, I must have miscounted, and then 6 is worship, and the number 7 is suffering for the gospel, right? Now, this isn't a confessional document. We don't subscribe to it, but it is interesting. And then he adds, does anybody remember? He actually then adds an 8th. Good works. Morality, he says, could also be considered a mark of the church, but then he immediately dismisses it because he says, could be faked by unbelievers. It's not that this is necessarily a dogmatic list, but it's showing, I think, that Luther understands this is going to live itself out. The pure teaching of the gospel and the right administration of the sacraments don't happen on Sunday morning and have no impact on the lives of the people and our corporate reality, right? So particularly I'm interested here today in Luther's inclusion of the public exercise of the keys. Now, the solid declaration refuses the idea that a congregation that does not practice public exclusion of sinners or has no regular process for excommunication is not a true congregation. It seems like my whole ministry I've heard people saying excommunication is not a mark of the church. That statement I could not find in Pieper. It's not, maybe it is there and I just couldn't find it. I thought it was there. I could not find it in the Confessions, in Luther, or in Melanchthon. I didn't look in Chemnitz. I did find it by John Pless. But to be sure, that is what this statement in the small called article, or the solid declaration, is getting at, right? That it's a correct summary, right? You can't say that if a congregation doesn't practice public exclusion or have a regular process for excommunication, you cannot say that's not a true Christian congregation. So I think the statement, excommunication is not a mark of the church, is accurate in the narrow sense. Walther does make a big deal of it in his Pastoral Theology. He goes on for a couple of pages explaining how excommunication isn't a mark of the church. Did anybody read that? And then, because this is hilarious to me. And then he immediately, so that's comment 1. Remember how that kind of works in the theology there. And comment 2 is the necessity of church discipline. So it's not a mark of the church, but it is necessary. And I think that's actually a very useful distinction, right? So I'm in favor of the way Walther hands it. And he cites Apology 11 and small called 3. The small called articles, I'll just read you this part. It says that the small, that is the truly Christian excommunication, that is the ban from Holy Communion of the openly unrepentant. The small excommunication is that public, obstinate sinners should not be admitted to the sacrament or other fellowship in the church until they improve their behavior and avoid sin. So there is something there that we know about this, and we have a definition of it in the small called articles. And then, again, I mistyped here, Melanchthon in the treatise actually includes excommunication as a specific duty given to the apostles. He writes, Christ gave to his apostles only spiritual authority. That is, the command to preach the gospel, to proclaim forgiveness of sins, to administer the sacraments, and to excommunicate the ungodly without the use of physical force. So that's in the treatise. This is part of the duty of the office of the ministry, which is part of it. Then he goes on, of course, he did not give them the power of the sword or the right to establish, take possession, or dispose of the kingdoms of the world. So, excommunication in itself is not a mark of the church, but the right teaching, which is the most central mark of the church, includes reproof, correction, and instruction in righteousness. Wolves must be fought off. And Luther's desire to include morality, right, at the end of that in 1539, I think is also a sign of the true church, in that we expect the gospel to actually have an impact on the lives of the people, right? And Jesus does say in the upper room, they will know you are my disciples by love, right? That is, by our lives. So I think this is sort of background to the lacking judiciary, right? But to have a sort of synodical judiciary, I think first we've got to have a congregational judiciary of some sort, right? And even before we can have that, I think we have to have a sort of familial judiciary. It's got to really start, it's got to kind of go in both directions, right? You have to actually discipline your own children. You have to actually discipline your congregation, and then the synod actually has to discipline pastors and congregations. And I don't think we can do one in isolation of the other. All right, so here's the particular weakness, in my opinion, of the LCMS, as evidenced in her glorious bylaws. Here is the bylaw that gives the scope and purpose of dispute resolution. It reads, dispute resolution, shall be the exclusive remedy to resolve such disputes that involve theological, doctrinal, or ecclesiastical issues, except those covered by bylaws section 2.14 and except as provided by bylaw 1.10 and shall be binding on all parties. So I know I'm not going to read you all these bylaws. It's a lot, which is another problem. But 2.14, that has to do with explicitly expulsion of a member from the synod. And that's pretty much a process that sits squarely in the district president and synodical president authority. But there is a kind of strange and confusing duplication here. So they're saying, look, dispute resolution it has to do with everything that involves theological, doctrinal, or ecclesiastical issues, except for these couple of exceptions, which includes expulsion of members. Well, how in the world are we having theological and doctrinal disputes that don't require expulsion of members if they're teaching false doctrine? So there's already got kind of this idea that you can have a doctrinal dispute that you can find a kind of compromise on that isn't sort of binary. Well, we'll get there in a second. So I think that's a problem. And I think it is a deviance from not only the scriptures in the Book of Concord, but also the Article 2 of the Constitution of the Missouri Synod, which says we're all going to have pure doctrine according to the Bible and the Book of Concord. 1.10, the other exception listed there, this is just like pure legalese stuff, right? Dispute resolution, it says, only seeks to remedy disputes and set forth procedures for expulsion from membership. I just don't quite even understand, again, how this works. I don't understand how dispute resolution can be valid if it's going to take up theological, doctrinal disputes that don't impact membership of the synod, because they're not really doctrinal. If we have a dispute about an exegetical opinion, right? Let's say about what happens to a man's soul, a Christian's soul, when he dies. Does it go into an intermediary state in the presence of God and the holy angels and wait for the resurrection of the dead, or does the soul of the Christian go immediately, instantaneously to the last day? We can disagree about that. That's called an open question, right? We have disagreements. We would not call that, I don't think we would call that a doctrinal dispute. If it's a doctrinal dispute, a theological dispute, it's not a matter of opinion, it's not an open question. Now maybe this is just a matter of terminology, but even if that's the case, then I have another problem, that we're using these words in a very kind of loose and confusing way. So that's the sort of point A, I would say, under what are the problems with this. Next, the other exceptions are sort of more reasonable, I think. And that is under this other bylaw, disputes concerning property rights, real estate arrangements, mortgages, fraud, or embezzlement, and disputes arising under contractual arrangements of all kinds, contracts for goods, services, or employment benefits are not covered under this. Yeah, that's because the government cares about those things, and they wouldn't let us do that, right? However, it says, this is great, it's stated here in the bylaws that the dispute resolution could be used if, quote, both parties to a dispute signed written statements agreeing to use and honor the outcome of the process. I would like to know if that has ever happened in the entire history. I cannot believe it ever has. No, right? So there's a problem here. Okay, I think we can already see the process is confused and complicated, but I'm going to show you a bit more without getting real deep into it. And to that end, here's the first part of the preamble of the dispute resolution process, which is like the main mode of the Missouri Synod to deal with problems and difficulties. It reads, when disputes, disagreements, or offenses arise among members of the body of Christ, it is a matter of grave concern for the whole church. Conflicts that occur in the body should be resolved promptly. Parties to disputes are urged by the mercies of God to proceed with one another with, quote, the same attitude which was in Christ Jesus, Philippians 2. In so doing, individuals, congregations, and various agencies within the Synod are urged to reject a win-lose attitude that typifies secular conflict. For the sake of the gospel, the church should spare no resource in providing assistance. All right, look, I know. The desire to handle this in a way that wins the brother is absolutely admirable and correct. But the binary standard that we are urged to reject, that is, the win-lose attitude, is in fact sometimes the absolutely right standard. I think that, so there's an attitude philosophy problem because false doctrine has to be rejected. We cannot enter into doctrinal disputes with a spirit of compromise or toleration. I also find it an outrageous overstatement to say that the church should spare no resource in providing assistance in this regard. In fact, as we all know, dispute resolution is not the top priority of the LCMS, and we are not cutting the president of Synod's salary or recalling foreign missionaries or closing seminaries to fund dispute resolution. And in fact, if you've been involved in these things, the accuser bears all of the cost of these things, and the Synod does not help. So, I mean, this is just what, so now, okay. You're probably thinking, Peterson, typically, petty, fighting over words. Okay, I don't think, maybe, but you might say, look, these words are just in the bylaws. It's a sort of pious wish. They don't have any weight. That would be fine with me, except that these are bylaws. And we need clear language for the sake of actual equity and justice, not pious wishes. And this gospel approach, if we can call it that, is simply the wrong approach in many cases. This is precisely why I think this process is misguided, even if the intentions are pure, because a judiciary does not seek peace. A judiciary seeks justice. The description of a judicial process is no place for pious platitude and religious sentimentality. So just saying the Synod should spare no resource in providing assistance, it's just not helpful, and in fact, it's misleading. Next, the next paragraph of the preamble. The Holy Scriptures urge Christians to settle their differences by laying them before the members of the brotherhood. Therefore, the Synod, in the spirit of 1 Corinthians 6, calls upon all parties to a disagreement, accusation, controversy, or disciplinary action to rely exclusively and fully on the Synod's system of reconciliation and conflict resolution. The use of the Synod's conflict resolution procedure shall be the exclusive and final remedy for those who are in dispute. Fitness for ministry and other theological matters must be determined within the church. Parties to dispute are urged, in matters of a doctrinal nature, to follow the procedures as outlined in Bylaw Section 1.8. This is another problem. Bylaw Section 1.8 is dissent. How do you dissent? I'm not going to analyze the whole dissent process. and bylaws, I'm just going to tell you, I think they're absolutely ridiculous. I don't think I don't know how you actually follow it. I have tried in a kind of ridiculous case once. Back in the Yankee Stadium days, there was a ruling was made, I can't remember, it's been a long time now, but a ruling was made, President Benke had appealed to a resolution of Synod that said something about praying, and they ruled it was a doctrinal resolution, which was ridiculous at the time. And so I said, well, if that's the doctrinal position of the Synod, then I dissent from it. And because we were trying to push it and show that it wasn't a doctrinal statement, right? Because this was how he's kind of getting out of this with this legal maneuvers. But the whole process was so dumb and so ridiculous. So I dissent from the position of Synod, which wasn't a doctrinal position. It was, and then I just have to keep my own opinion to myself. I'm supposed to teach what I think is false doctrine, and nobody's allowed to talk about it while this is going on. Well, if you believe that something is false doctrine, you cannot keep quiet about it. So the dissent thing, I think, is problematic, and I don't know what the exact answer is to this, but it's not good. So that's what they're talking about. If it's a doctrinal nature, follow the procedures as outlined in bylaw section 1.8. Well, it's problematic. So I just think, again, that it's not just pious exaggeration and wishful thinking. I think this is actually factually wrong, because the other issue is dispute resolution, and we've already seen it's not the exclusive procedure for doctrinal disputes. As already mentioned, you have this bylaw 2.14, expulsion of congregations or individuals from membership in Synod, which allows members of Synod, apart from this process, to make a formal complaint against another member of Synod over doctrine or life to the district presidents. So this is also a complicated and I think flawed process. So bylaw 2.14 will eventually provide a kind of jury for the accused if the district president finds against him, but it gives almost no rights to the accuser. Now, I understand the weight should fall to the accused, right? So, I mean, this is kind of an American ideal, innocent until proven guilty, and so forth. And I'm in favor of that. Nonetheless, doctrinal accusations are not petty. They should be taken with great weight, and they are binary. So if the accused is found innocent and the case is dismissed, then the accuser is guilty. That can't just be let go, right? So he needs to repent and recant, and he should receive the same level of attention and spiritual care and potential consequences that the accused is promised in the process. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a quick summary of how I may be misreading it because it is complicated and I'm not a lawyer. But here's how I understand the process is supposed to work. The district president is somehow made aware that there could be some false doctrine in his district. He could have noticed it, he could be suspicious of it, or somebody could file a complaint. He then investigates and he determines if there's any merit to the idea. If he decides that there isn't, so if Adam comes and tells Miscus that Peterson's teaching against infant baptism, right? And then Miscus, who's our district president, comes and investigates and determines that I'm not doing that. That's the end of it usually. Which is already, so the district president has kind of great authority to sort of dismiss this thing. It's not completely the end because the accuser can then appeal to the synodical president. If he dismisses it, then it really is over and there's no appeal. So it can be dismissed pretty easily. Now, there are a few other things you can do. You can bring resolutions to Synod. You can make a fuss on the internet. You know, we know there's other ways. But technically, that's the process. Next, if the district president decides that there is merit to the case, then it gets really complicated. So the district president will then follow procedures for admonition, right? And it's all in the spirit of reconciliation, win the brother, and so forth. But if the accused does not repent and recant to the district president's satisfaction, then the district president can either place him on restricted status or suspended status, or even remove him from the roster. The accused can appeal any of those decisions, and if the district president has not consulted with the synodical president and decides in favor of the accused or against the accused, so if the district president says, I'm going to restrict the guy, he can appeal this to the synodical president. If the district president didn't consult with the synodical president, but decides after investigation that the accused is innocent, then the accuser can appeal to the synodical president. But here is a strange loophole. If the district president in his investigation consults with the synodical president and then decides that the accused is innocent, the accuser has no appeal. This just happened to a friend of mine. That's how I knew. He was the accuser, by the way. You probably could have guessed that. So that's a strange sort of thing. If both the district president and the synodical presidents find that there is cause for expulsion, they do have to tell the accused. Then the accused has 15 days to file an appeal. If the case is found in his favor by the appeal panel, then there is no appeal for the accuser or for the district president that thought he was guilty. It's over. As soon as you're declared innocent, all things go away, right? That's sort of the process. If the accused files for an appeal and gets if he loses that first appeal, he's got another appeal to a kind of jury who will decide his case. Again, if they find in his favor, the district president that found him guilty, the synodical president found him guilty, the accuser, none of them get an appeal. Once he's declared innocent, that's it. He's innocent. And that's the way it goes. So the accused gets lots of chances, lots of appeals. As soon as somebody decides he's not guilty, it's over. I think this is really problematic. Or at the very least, I think the accuser then ought to have to prove himself. Right? So, and I just want to read you a quote here, because after I read all of that, my head was spinning. From Alexander Hamilton. Concerning the making of laws, he writes, "It will be of little avail to the people that laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood." Let the reader understand. I think this is a kind of problem also, just the complicated reality of it. Now, both the dispute resolution process and this expulsion process require face-to-face meetings with those who are in conflict, with the burden being and the cost on the accuser. Both also acknowledge that this is an extra-biblical requirement in the case of public sin. So they read similarly. I'm going to read you from the dispute resolution bylaw. It says, Matthew 18 does not apply directly in cases of public sin, but face-to-face meetings are required nonetheless, even in the case of public sin, toward the goal of reconciliation and winning the brother and sister. The parties and others attempting to effect resolution of a dispute must always remain mindful that the church has been given the ministry of reconciliation. Hence, conflict resolution in the church is to lead to reconciliation, restoring the erring member in a spirit of gentleness. Its aim is to avoid the adversarial system practiced in society. Okay, I understand that covenants of love by human right can bind men insofar as they do not violate the word of God. So we can agree, for example, that we are going to follow Robert's Rules of Order, even though the Bible doesn't require it. And so theoretically, perhaps, we could say that even though Matthew 18 does not require face-to-face meetings or forbids speaking publicly about public sin, we are going to require it. And I can imagine a reason for this in today's world with social media and all of that nonsense. Nonetheless, I don't think we should. I think that this ends up treating public sin as though it's not public sin but private. And I think that's a problem, not only because it seems that we are more concerned about reconciliation than the Bible, which is to say, than God is, but also because we are acting in ways that protect the reputation of those who are engaged in public sin while they sin, and we are failing to warn the church. And of course, whenever you talk about this public sin stuff, the two Bible passages are, of course, Galatians 2:6, where Paul's confrontation of Peter is before all of them, because Peter's preaching was public and was misleading people. And then when Paul tells Timothy to rebuke those who are sinning in the presence of all, that they may also fear. So we certainly want to win the brother, but we also want to protect the church. And that's not some small, insignificant thing, right? We're sort of putting the sort of good of the individual above the good of the whole group, which, by the way, is like the pervasive American legal problem, right? So, but the real rub for me is this bold, unqualified statement, which I think gives away the whole game. Conflict resolution in the church is to lead to reconciliation, restoring the erring member in a spirit of gentleness. Its aim is to avoid the adversarial system practiced in society. Okay, in the first place, our aim should be more than to avoid the adversarial system practiced in society. It should be to speak the truth in love. And nor should we hint that the adversarial system used in society is somehow wicked. Lutheran theology used to be built upon disputation. Nor should we say, even in bylaws, what conflict resolution will do. The best we can honestly say is that our desire is that anyone erring would be convinced of his sins, repent, and restored to fellowship. We should not say that all will repent and believe, and that our defining mark is gentleness, and this is the system that will fix problems. I mean, again, maybe that's being a little petty with the wording, but I do think it matters some. All right, so that's a taste, a small taste of this process. What should the judiciary look like? Well, it ought to have the best of the laity and the clergy on it. Perhaps actually something like the complicated makeup of the CTCR, could be used. But the Synod's pretty good at actually forming these sorts of things that have this kind of broad representation from the church. It definitely needs to have lay people on it, I think, based on the treatise. And here's the reading from the treatise in fullness, which I alluded to earlier. It is especially necessary for the most eminent members of the church, the kings and princes, to attend to the church and take care that errors are removed and consciences restored to health, just as God expressly exhorts them. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth, Psalm 2. The first concern of kings should be to promote the glory of God. It would therefore be most shameful for them to use their authority and power to encourage idolatry and countless other disgraceful acts and to slaughter the saints. So we had a board of adjudication at one point in the Synod. No system is perfect. I think it was better than what we have now. So really, what should it look like? I would say a place to start. Why don't we just go back? Why don't we just undo this dispute resolution and go back to this board of adjudication? I think that the spirit and the intent of the dispute resolution is just not fitting for doctrinal disputes. That's my grave, or I mean, not even grave, but that would be my basic concern. I don't think we have a functioning judiciary. I don't think we have a good grasp of how to actually practice excommunication at a congregational level in a society where our congregations are voluntary associations. And we've been probably weak and cowardly in the minor ban as well. We also, I don't think, have had a really good system about how to enact the minor ban in a public way. So my own experience in using the minor ban, it only works if the person who is placed under it is cooperative, right? If he's willing to go along with it, he's willing, and I have had members that have been. So look, this guy is living with his girlfriend, and I say, you got to stop this. And he says, I don't really think it's wrong. And I say, well, you can't have Holy Communion. And he says, but you got to keep coming to church. And he says, okay. And I've had members do that and come to church and then just conveniently go to the bathroom during communion. And while it sort of got worked out kind of behind the scenes. And I think that's fine to some degree if he's cooperative, right? But if he isn't cooperative, I had another case within the last few years where I put a guy under the ban, minor ban, didn't tell anybody except the elders. And then he went around to different churches in Fort Wayne and tried to take communion. Now, he understood it. He knew it. So he would tell the pastor, I wonder, Peterson said I can't have communion. And because he doesn't think I'm repentant just because I'm having this affair and divorcing my wife. And the pastors, several of them did not give him communion, but then one did. And so that was a problem. And then that guy just told me he went to Fort Wayne Seminary. He'd never heard of the ban. He didn't know it was such a thing. So he was really surprised. So I had to teach him about that, you know. But it was, welcome to the reality. But I think, I do want to put all the blame on him, but there probably actually needs to be, and John Hill tries to do this in Wyoming, it probably should be some sort of public announcement, at least in the local context. Tell the other Missouri Synod pastors in Fort Wayne this guy's under the ban. But we've been so concerned about protecting that person's reputation that we haven't known how to do that. And I'm including myself in that. I've not known how to do that. And so, am I spitting on stuff? What's wrong? No. Okay. That was the first one, and I think the most significant one. This apostolic succession thing, though, I'm also very bothered by. It's problematic, I think. The confessions don't deal with this as directly because they're not really so concerned about the mark of the church of apostolicity, right? But in the treatise, Melanchthon does write a little bit about ordination by a presbyteros. He writes, Jerome then teaches that the distinctions of degree between bishop and presbyter, hard to do this in English, or pastor, are established by human authority. That is clear from the way it works. For, as I have stated above, the power is the same. One thing subsequently created a distinction between bishops and pastors, and that was ordination. For it was arranged that one bishop would ordain the ministers in a number of churches. However, since the distinction of rank between bishop and pastor is not by divine right, it is clear that an ordination performed by a pastor in his own church is valid by divine right, right? So here's really kind of the argument. Here's the Peterson summary version of what's going on. No Lutheran ever ordained himself or was ordained by simply lay people. There is no distinction in the Bible between presbyteros, right, which would be elder, literally, or what we think of as pastor, and episkopos, which would be overseer or bishop. They're used interchangeably in the New Testament and in the early church also to some degree. So anyone who is ordained by a presbyteros, a pastor, and whether or not that person has a genealogy that proves that presbyteros who was ordained rightly by somebody who was ordained rightly and so forth, right, doesn't matter. He has the same ordination as one ordained by a bishop with paperwork. Because what really constitutes apostolicity is doctrine. That's what matters, right? To have the same doctrine as the apostles, not to have this kind of somewhat imaginary paper trail, right? Or maybe not, you have a paper trail, but what its content might be imaginary. What matters is you have the same doctrine. And of course, the paperwork is in no way a guarantee of orthodoxy or apostolic doctrine, right? You know, Leo the whatever he is has the paperwork, and he's the Antichrist, right? He does not have the apostolic doctrine. So it's no guarantee, and Gerhardt, I'm not quoting a Gerhardt throughout all this, but Gerhardt goes on at this great length, of course, and very well argues it. So the treatise is simply insisting, right? So he's saying, look, the charge is, you Lutherans aren't legit pastors, you don't have valid sacraments because you weren't ordained by a bishop. And Melanchthon's like, look, this isn't as though we just picked one day in our living room I didn't just decide to make myself a pastor. Right? We've never had a separation from the actual church, but that's not where our confidence lies. Our confidence lies in the Word of God. That's what's been handed to us. And that is essential. That really is essential because the treatise insists that the right of ordination belongs to the church, not to the ministry itself in general, and certainly not to a certain class of ministers. It has been arranged, right, that for good order, the bishops would take care of this. They would do the ordaining. And we still basically follow this. Our district presidents do the ordaining, right? I mean, they might authorize someone else, but it's under their kind of jurisdiction by human right. So Melanchthon writes again, the right is a gift bestowed exclusively on the church, and no human authority can take it away from the church, as Paul testifies to the Ephesians when he says, when he ascended on high, he gave gifts to his people. Among those gifts belonging to the church, he lists pastors and teachers, and he adds that such are given for serving and building up the body of Christ. Therefore, where the true church is, there must also be the right of choosing and ordaining ministers. Just as in an emergency, even a layperson grants absolution and becomes the minister or pastor of another. And then he tells that most ridiculous hypothetical of all stories, right? From the mouth and authority of none other than Augustine. Two guys get into a boat. One is baptized and the other is not. There are no clergy present. The baptized one baptizes the unbaptized, and the newly baptized Christian then absolves his baptizer, right? That's the story. And this is Melanchthon's evidence, not from the Bible, but from the history of the church, that we've never thought that the bishops had some sort of special power. And Melanchthon explains, pertinent here are the words of Christ that assert that the keys were given to the church, not just to particular persons, for where two or three are gathered in my name, and so forth. Now, Gerhardt really gives this masterful description of the history of the office of the ministry from the fall to modern times, and demonstrates from Scripture that God promises to preserve the office of the ministry for the sake of his church until he returns in glory. I do not think this is a topic that Pieper takes up. I don't remember seeing it in Pieper. I didn't go looking explicitly for this, but I learned this from Gerhardt. I'm just going to give you a few highlights of this to demonstrate from Gerhardt what is apostolic succession and how has God preserved it among us. I'm gonna skip the Old Testament stuff, though that's beautiful and important, but to where it kind of comes to us. So he brings in several passages from Isaiah, and then he goes to Matthew 20. And of course, in the 20th century, American evangelicals became obsessed with this passage and called it the Great Commission. And they understood it as being spoken to the whole church. But as we all know, our Lord contextually speaks it explicitly to the 11. Now, to be sure, these 11 are representatives of the whole church, but the promise is made differently. So, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age, is in fact not a promise of the spiritual indwelling of Christ. I've heard this many times in sermons, right? Lo, I am with you always. Therefore, you know Jesus is always with you. Well, Jesus is always with you, but that's not what this passage is talking about. This passage is talking about, right, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations by baptizing and teaching. And lo, I am with you always in the baptizing and the teaching to make disciples. This is a promise of Christ's presence and power in the apostolic ministry of preaching and teaching. And that's exactly the way Gerhardt handles it, because he doesn't know about the Great Commission. So he writes, because the apostles did not live that long, this must be referred also to the apostles' successors in the ecclesiastical ministry. Therefore, Christ is promising that through the word of the apostles, he will gather a church to himself from all mankind unto the end of the world, and likewise that he will protect the ministry of the word and sacraments, through which ministry the church in the world is gathered against all the fury of Satan in the world. Chrysostom and from him Theophylact write about this passage, not the Great Commission, but this passage about the apostolic ministry. He made his promise about being with them, not only to the apostles, but simply to all his disciples. After all, the apostles were not going to live until the end of the world. Thus, he made this promise both to us and to those who will be after us. Gerhardt then goes on with a few other New Testament promises about the preservation of the ministry. Next, he demonstrates that these promises do not bind the succession of ministers of the New Testament church to any one place, to any particular church, to one people, etc. Rather, they are general promises about the future preservation of the church and of the ecclesiastical ministry, either here or in another place, among this people or among another people. He makes a number of other arguments about this, but the two that I think are most important in the current sort of controversy have to do with the hiddenness of pure ministers. He writes, "One cannot infer from those promises that the ecclesiastical ministry will always be pure, publicly conspicuous and visible to all. For just as the true church can exist and yet be hidden in the wilderness, so also there can be pure ministers in the church, though they may not be publicly visible to all." And his final argument then serves as a corrective against self-appointed ministers. So again, no Lutheran ever ordains himself. Gerhardt writes, "God's serious complaint about those who run but were not sent, and his threat to punish those who thrust themselves into this office without a call, as well as the punishment inflicted on God on those who presumed to usurp a function not given to them, must be taken with utmost seriousness." Now, why does this matter? Because the church needs the ministry, and the ministry exists to serve her. If the devil puts us in a boat or in a Siberian prison, then the Lord will still provide without bishops. He can raise up bishops from stones. But again, that's never happened because no true Lutheran was ever baptized in a boat by a confirmand only to turn around and absolve his baptizer. We have all been ordained either by presbyteroi or by maybe an episcopoi, but between those two, there is no divine distinction. And in our context, none of us has been ordained either without a call and without functions. But that's a whole nother can of worms, and the history of that's way messier because in Wittenberg they did. But that's a story for another day. All right, my final thing here, and then we'll have some time for you to yell at me, I guess, is I want to think about this, some of the nomenclature stuff, how we talk about the office of the ministry and how we understand its functions among us. And this is really not very theological. I mean, it's a little bit, but so here we have from the Apology 14, we read, "We want to point out again that we would willingly retain ecclesiastical and canonical order as long as the bishops desisted from their cruelty against our churches. This willingness will be our defense, both before God and among all nations, present and future, against the charge that we have undermined the authority of the bishops." I think here we see implicit that an episcopal form of government would be tolerable to the Lutheran confessions. Certainly not required, but you would be able to say on the basis of this, the Lutheran confessions are absolutely against an episcopal form of government. There's nothing that I can find in the confessions or in the Bible that would say that the Bible or the confessions prefer voters' assemblies. I have heard some strange exegesis about the laying on of hands as being voting, but I don't buy it at all, right? Now that being said, I do not actually want an episcopal form of government or polity for the Missouri Synod because it seems to me that the history of Lutheranism is in fact the history of bad bishops. And I also, so I actually like the way in general that the Missouri Synod has tried to organize herself in terms of voting. I like the fact that it looks on paper like perfect equality between laity and clergy, but in fact is it totally weighted towards the clergy because the clergy wield influence over the laity and the laity don't always show up because they have to take off work to do it. So there is a weight towards the clergy that I think is appropriate in the church because the clergy are better suited to make theological decisions. So I like that. At the same time, I also like the fact that the laity are there. I think they need to be there, and they are an absolutely necessary corrective to clergy blindness, to all sorts of things, and to abuse. Right? All of the heresies in the history of the church were started by the clergy, including anti-clericalism. I don't think the lay people have ever made up heresy. I mean, probably individuals, but they don't get any traction with it. And the laity historically have done much to save the church and to be a safeguard. And we did have that quote from the treatise that also I think is important. that the laity need to be ruling the church also. So I'm not looking for an episcopal form of government. I actually like the way this works, and I think it's reasonable. I mean, it's not perfect, but nothing is. However, I think our understanding of the ministry has been watered down, and so here is the first part of my fantasy ministerium of the Missouri Synod. I would like to see every man on the roster, everyone who's ordained minister in the Missouri Synod, tied in some way to an altar and pulpit with duties there, however scarce and rare they might be. In fact, I think that this terminology of auxiliary minister, which we used for school teachers, would actually be a spot-on description, not for the school teacher, but for seminary professors, mission executives, librarians, and so forth. Because I think that the work that they're doing is actually supportive of the office of the ministry and is part of the office of the ministry, but is not presbyteroi. So, but it's a pretty clumsy term, auxiliary minister, and it's kind of loaded in our circles because we used it for school teachers. And then we went even beyond that, right? The roster book of the Missouri Synod has an insane number of categories in it, including all kinds of girls. So why not, why not have, like, these men that are serving in the office of the ministry, but with specialized duty, why not tie them to an altar and a congregation, right, where we actually see in the most visible ways the marks of the church? And I'm not ripping on the seminary or these mission execs or anybody else, but right, you don't really see at the seminary the preaching of the gospel and the administration of the sacraments, right? You see parts of it, but it's not, right? So that I think this just makes total sense. I think it'd be good for them. I think it'd be good for the congregations. I think it'd be actually kind of traditional. And really, of course, you're probably all thinking, and you're right, the term for that, of course, in the New Testament probably, or at least in the early church, is deacon. But look, whatever. That deacon is probably not worth trying to salvage because of Baptists and all sorts of other confusions. Why don't we just call them associate pastors, right? But let's tie them to the altar. I think that'd be good. I think that would be an improvement, and I think that would clarify some things. I never bought Robert Preuss's argument that he was a pastor of the seminary, but the professors were not. And the argument he made, it's been a long time since I read it. I didn't rehearse it again. But the argument that I remember was that he believed that he was the pastor because the faculty and the students were his flock. And if you have a flock, you're a pastor. The problem with that for me is, like, all of those students belong to congregations, and they think that the pastor of that congregation is their pastor, and that pastor thinks they're his flock, not Robert's, right? So Robert was like, I'm a pastor, I have a call because I have a flock, but my professors have to sign contracts and can be fired, right? So is that not fair?
No, that's not accurate.
Okay. What was it then? What was the argument?
The opposite. His call was as professor. That was his divine call.
Okay.
And presidency was attached to it. But the objection he made from his removal was primarily as the professor. That was also the position he took in his article on Augsburg 14 in the Lutheran Fathers, the call in the Confessions of the Fathers, referring to the professorship.
But he didn't believe the other professors had calls.
No, they did, absolutely. In fact, when Kurt Marquardt got his contract, and Marquardt objected to Dad, I don't want a contract, I want a call. Dad told him, I totally agree, you're going to get the call. But this is the system we're stuck with.
Yeah, okay.
But he did not agree that a professor should be contracted. Now, did they remove a guy by the name of Dan Brooke on that basis?
Yeah.
Okay, well, whatever works.
Sure.
But no,
yeah.
he had the position that a professor was a pastor just like he was. That was his position.
Okay, I'd have to go back and reread it. That's not the way I remembered it being. I thought there was a defense of. I thought he made a distinction. He didn't make a distinction between himself and the rest of the faculty.
Not as far as the call,
As the call?
to the ministry of the word is concerned. Now, if he had just commented about, by analogy, just as a pastor has a congregation, I'm the president and this is my congregation, I think he might have made a statement like that, but certainly not in some kind of a dogmatic sense.
Okay.
That as a president of a seminary, that is what gave him the office rather than the professorship. That I can guarantee
Okay.
you was not his position. And if you read his essay or whatever on Article 14, and you'll see that that's the case.
Okay, fair enough. I think in any case, we don't see the seminary professors doing things like, I lost my place here, providing typically kind of on a regular basis confession and absolution, premarital counseling, the sacrament of the altar, and so forth to the students. They're pretty much focused on teaching and teaching in somewhat of a narrow way. And I think that's why it would be very helpful to put them into a more clear context. I would have loved to seen, Dr. Preuss have a call to ascension, and have kind of clear pastoral duties. I think it would have been cleaner, and I think, frankly, it would have also been good for him as a person, and it would have been a great blessing to ascension. So that's the idea. And I'm not just, wasn't picking on him or on anybody. I just think that we've been actually kind of inconsistent with this, and we've been messy with this. And it's hard to resist, I think, when you're the person in charge, having the sort of ability to have your subordinates sign contracts that will make them easy to get rid of. And because there is some messiness, and this goes way beyond seminaries. I mean, we're talking about this is at the International Center and kind of across the board. So that would maybe free some of that. I do know that the current policy of the Synod Inc. is that no employee of the Synod who's working directly for the Synod, except the president of the Synod, is allowed to have a call to a congregation. So if you go down there and become, I don't know what they are. What are these jobs down there? Not world relief, director of whatever. Lutheran witness, right? So Roy Askins cannot have a call to a congregation as an associate pastor where he belongs. The Synod forbids that. And I can kind of get it from their point of view. Why wouldn't you? I want to own you in every way and control you. Sure you do. But it does sort of play a little bit roughshod over this, I think. So again, I'm not trying to rip on any particular person. I'm just saying I think these are concerns, and I think we could do better, and I think we could. I would leave the term pastor alone. I think, though, in fairness, presbyteros would be much more accurately translated as father, which is much closer to the word elder, and which is much more actually descriptive of the work that we do. But I don't think it's in any way worth it. We know what a pastor is, fine, leave it alone. But I do think we could recover the term bishop for our district presidents. In fact, they are functioning in a way that is correspondent to what bishops were doing historically, or they're supposed to be doing what bishops did historically. And the terminology of ecclesiastical supervisor, that is overseer, right? That is episcopus, right? But I don't think overseer is going to cut it, right? Master, overseer, these are not good terms in our context. And I think superintendent is also just way too fussy. So whatever, but I think president is not that helpful either. There is a certain sense you could say they're presiding over the district, but I don't know that they really are. And I think it's too loaded with kind of corporate and executive power in the United States. I think bishop's the right word for both the district presidents and the synodical presidents, and even maybe the first vice president or whatever. But the idea would be, again, to tie those men also, like Matt Harrison has done, right? He has an associate, I think, to tie each of them to an altar, right? And then to say your job, right, is not primarily to set the budget of the district, right, and to oversee the programs of the district. your primary job is to lead by teaching and by example, right? You're to lead the district with theology, not coercion, which is budgets. Budgets are coercion, right? And that sort of thing. If we could do that. Now, maybe this is a total fantasy. I get it, but that's sort of what this, I think, is. And maybe what we would really need to do, and this would be, again, dangerous and difficult and potentially expensive, but maybe what we should do is consider separating the sort of powers of ruling in the church into left-hand and right-hand kingdom. So would it be possible, and they sort of did this in Canada in the LCC. They don't have bishops, they have regional pastors. That's what they're calling them. They're bishops. There are district presidents, but they don't have any administrative duties. And they don't have they're trying to lead their districts by teaching them and by example, the way it's done in the church, and by, going and visiting and then saying, Ed, that was a pretty good sermon. Why'd you do this? This part was distracting. I think you could do better, right? Actually counseling, right? Giving godly counsel, giving advice, rebukes, admonitions included, and potentially when there's false doctrine, removals, right? But then taking away from them the sort of power of the sword. So there you go. Whether we pick that nomenclature or not, I do think that it's just hard to kind of resist when you start really thinking about this. It's hard to resist the kind of seemingly natural threefold division of the ministry by human right that we do see expressed in the New Testament, though not mandated, and we certainly see enacted in the history of the church until most recent times. So it does seem like we could use different terminology if we need to, but those would be ways to clean this up and I think be helpful. So there you go. I think we've got 15 minutes.
I'm going to have this.
Hello. Okay. So please do use the mic for questions so that our recorders can pick up the audio clearly, and you don't need to bury your face in them. In fact, I'm going to turn this one down a little bit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I very much appreciate your paper. You should join our Winkle. Because I very much appreciate much of what you said. When you started out, you spoke about excommunication, and I wrote a paper on that many years ago. The Schwenkenfelders, which are mentioned in our confessions, and there's actually a Schwenkenfelder society in the United States today, and I actually got some books and material from them. But I formed in my paper on that time, it said the right preaching of the gospel. And because the right preaching of the gospel is a preaching about righteousness, and therefore also about the failure of our ability to keep the law, and therefore the marks of the church in terms of excommunication of the preaching of the law. And so I don't think you can have a right preaching of the gospel without the preaching of the law. And so I approached it on that subject, and I just wonder if that would be an approach that you would also take then, or think would be appropriate in terms of, because the law is not a mark of the church.
I think the law is a mark of the church. Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I'm just making this mark that we look at the mark of the church as the gospel and the word in sacraments, which are the promises of God.
Yeah.
And the power of God, which is the law really belongs to even the world. I mean,
I think the gospel there is broad sense of the term. I don't think we can take that as I think it's broad sense. It means the whole, the right teaching of the gospel in that context, I think, means the whole counsel of God, the right teaching of all of it. So I would even say the right administration of the sacraments right? The right administration of the sacraments means telling some people no, right? It doesn't mean, just using bread. I mean, that's a good place to start. Use bread and wine, use the words, right? But so anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that was basically the gist of that. I just wanted to mention
Yeah.
that that's how I approach it at that time.
So I agree with you, I think.
And then I do, when you talk about judiciary, it's also interesting because in Robert's Rules of Order and other things, and I've experienced this through the years, having defended people that are, I thought, falsely accused, etc., that and I've had other people defend me. But the thing is that oftentimes in the Robert's Rules of Order, the president or the presidents get to appoint the committees that then decide the rightness or wrongness, and so then it's like almost like the committee, defends the president or defends others. And so how easy is it for the body itself to accuse itself or to find judgment against itself?
Right.
When you're talking about the ecclesiastical body.
Yeah. No, it's true. There's a lot of, when it comes to bylaw 2.14, this expulsion of members, the presidents have an incredible amount of authority and weight on them. And, like any system, if you have a good man in it, great. And it's not that we can design a system that will overcome wicked men, but we can design systems that are less easily manipulated and abused by wicked men. So it's a lot of weight right now on that side of things. I'm also, I should have looked at this more carefully, but it was complicated. There's if you get to the very end of this process, if you lose and then finally you're accused and you keep losing and you finally get towards the end of it in these appeals, they finally assign this jury. But I don't know if there's ever any lay people on any of these. The last one might have the possibility to have laity on it, but up to that point, it's like a committee of other district presidents, right? It's not. So it seems to me that we're missing something there. Oh, this could be painful.
Thanks for your paper, and I'll just, since you talked about seminary professors, and maybe just to kind of go with Pastor Preuss's point, I think the seminary professor has historically been understood differently among Lutherans, right? Because, he is a teacher of the church, right?
Right.
And Luther actually emphasizes this point, right? Well, since I know we don't think much of doctorates today, and that's fine, but just thinking in the tradition, right? He says, I have a doctorate, I've been authorized by the church to teach. And if you think too about confessionally, right, it's an office of preaching, an office of teaching, right? The word is foundational, and it doesn't mean that there aren't obviously there are other ways that the word then is exercised in pastoral care, sacraments, counseling, confession and absolution. But I also think, I wonder if it's more a problem with how maybe certain professors approach, their duties, and if they don't want to see themselves as pastors, right? But there are, I think, some professors who also recognize that they are pastors, and so things like confession and absolution, and even the opportunity to celebrate the sacraments for people does come up.
Yeah, so I'm not casting any aspersions or doubts about the validity of these offices. I think, though, I do have some, and we've talked about this in other contexts, but I really would like to see the sacrament of the altar limited to congregational worship. I am actually going to, my intent, whatever happens in the next 2 weeks, I think I can make this happen either way. I am going to try to force the CTCR to answer this question about is it appropriate for conventions and conferences and seminaries to celebrate the sacrament of the altar. And it's gotten for those unaware of it, 30 years ago, the Fort Wayne Seminary had communion once a week, once a month on a weekday at chapel, and it was St. Paul's Lutheran Church that sponsored it in a very kind of visible way. The pastor from St. Paul's came there, and it was supposed to be a service of St. Paul's. And it felt pretty phony, but at least the pastor from St. Paul's was there, right? But that was what was done. And then it did change later, about 10 or 15 years later, and now I think each service is still technically sponsored by St. Paul's, but there's no kind of transparency in how that's being done. I mean, seminary profs, because now they celebrate communion not just once a week, but once a week on Wednesday every week, and then also on feast days. And I'm not sure it's being done in the way that is the most appropriate and helpful. I'm not sure that, there's been some confusions for sure, again, with this church relations stuff. I commune John Kleinig, and we were not in fellowship with the Lutheran Church of Australia. But it was a little awkward because he's communing at the seminary, and he's communing at the International Center, he's communing all these other places. Now, he's our friend and all this, and he's right with us, and maybe we should, we could argue those things, but we were, this decision seemed to have been made by the president of the seminary in Fort Wayne. I don't know if he consulted the pastor at St. Paul's or not. He could have, but there wasn't any transparency to see. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, actually, I think with the sacrament of the altar, this is an interesting question, and this is much more of maybe you have the tradition of the bishop is the one who ultimately celebrates, or at least authorizes celebration, and that suggests, intimate pastoral care with who's.
Yeah. I don't mean to be disrespectful to seminary professors or to Robert Preuss or these people. I don't think we've been as precise in this as we could have been, and I think it's legit to have specialized ministers in the church. Gerhardt makes a great argument about this, right? To have an ordained man as a librarian actually makes a lot of sense, even though it might seem like, oh, he's not doing word and sacrament. Well, he is doing this auxiliary work that's important, that his understanding and his theological education matter for this librarian work. I believe that, or mission execs or whatever it might be. So I'm not bothered by this, I'm not doubting, but I think we could do better is the point. That's why I said I don't, this is kind of a practical concern. I'm not making a giant theological point, but I think if we're looking about how can we improve polity, what could make things more clean and have good order, and we'd have a better, I don't want to say there isn't proper pastoral oversight, that's going on, but here's another related thing. I don't know, I'm confused about confession and absolution in regards to, what if one of your members comes to me and wants absolution? That feels inappropriate to me. I've typically told them no. It feels like that's not really my place, even though I'm a pastor, because it's not my jurisdiction. But it can be a little bit dicey. Now, I tell my own wife that I'm not hearing her confession. So, I send her somewhere else, because I think that's it. Some of you probably disagree with me on this. I don't think you should hear your wife's confession. I think that she deserves a father confessor that is distinct, and I think the offices are too blurred there. But Rick and I have talked about this quite a bit. He doesn't agree with me at all, but that's not the only thing he's wrong about. But anyway, so I don't know. That's my point. So if it came off harsh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it to be.
It doesn't come off harsh. I know this is something that gets talked about and thought about a lot. It's good to bring it up. I think I would make the point that
professors are a special category.
Is actually not the same as a mission exec or a librarian. He's a teacher of the church, and he's called to do that.
Yeah, Judy also made a big deal about this, and so I have heard this argument quite a bit. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's true. How's that? But there certainly has always been in the history of Lutheranism, at least in our kind of Lutheranism, and from Prussia and the northern part, a preeminence of professors and a kind of special recognition. I'm not sure. Seminary professor, though, might be a slightly nuanced term in our circles that didn't, right? They weren't just seminary professors.
Well, if they were, I mean, if
They
they
were-
were
but-
ordained, they were.
They were teaching theology.
Divinity,
Divinity, okay.
Theology or whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it, but yeah.
All right, got 2 minutes left.
Well, I think this is a very interesting discussion and, that you're having here, and this is the reason I said you should be in our Winkle, specifically because I do think that your emphasis on the congregation here is good, and I very much appreciate that, although we are called the Orthodox Lutheran Ministerium for a reason. We also like to involve the ministerium in this. But the whole idea of jurisdiction and the duties of a seminary professor and other synodical offices in terms of, and I think you're kind of getting at this, wherever you have the opening of heaven, that is the proclamation of the gospel, you also have the right to close heaven. And so if somebody has jurisdiction to offer the Lord's Supper to somebody, then they also have the right to close. And so I wonder oftentimes at these various conferences and other things, who is the bishop, who's the overseer, who is determining that this person or that person should be have heaven opened or closed in terms of the office of the keys. And I just wonder, and so then also when you mentioned that the synodical bylaws forbid pastors from having a call from a congregation, that's
No, not synodical bylaws, I don't think, just the synodical policy
policy.
or whatever. I mean, it's not, yeah. That is a difference, I mean,
Yeah,
but
okay.
yeah.
Well, I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, they would say, the synodical policy would be they have a call, right? So Roy Askins, who's a friend, great guy, doing good work, he has a call to run this news magazine for the Missouri Synod, right? And that's why they don't want him to have another call to a congregation. So that would be their argument. They wouldn't say he doesn't have a call. Are we gonna, okay, sure. I don't care, it's not my conference, we can go over.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm new to LCMS. I just don't have any historical background for the Synod, but what's the history with the use of the term bishop? And what were the arguments for and against the
Well,
use of it?
I'll tell you what J.A. O'Preuss said. He said in the Missouri Synod we don't have bishops, we have sons of bishops. So, there's no history of it being used in the Missouri Synod outside of the English district, really, and that happened officially about 40 years ago. Does that sound right, Adam? So, but before 1975, I don't think there was anywhere in the Missouri Synod where the terminology was used, and to this day, it's really only used officially in the English district. The English district president is called the bishop, but the bylaws and constitution require that he be called the president. So he has to be the district president. But we could call him an apostle. We could call him anything we want in addition, as long as we also call him the president. So there's no history of it.
We don't know why they didn't use the term.
I would suspect it has something to do with Stephen. And the bad history of bishops in the Missouri Synod, right? So the Missouri Synod followed Bishop Stephen over here, and then he got into some bad stuff and problems, and there was some abuses there, and a kind of totalitarian use of the office of the keys that he claimed because he was a bishop, and so I think that's probably a lot to do with it. That would be. You think that's unfair? The room think that's unfair?
No, that's.
It's probably the reason we've avoided it. But it's been a long time. He's dead. Maybe we could move on.
Okay, thank you.